Today is repair the cars day. Well, I think every day is going to be repairing the cars day. So the Triumph is sitting here waiting for a replacement distributor because it's been behaving very weirdly. Recently, the Radical is here for its overhaul. You have to change the oil every 6 hours on that car. Every 6 hours of track time, not every 6 hours, otherwise you'd be changing oil all the time. And the Elise is sitting in Julie's spot because I've got to do the brakes. Well, I don't have to do the brakes, but I realised I had a set of spare brake pads and they are getting pretty low. So Natasha, who's looking for mice, probably, and I are going to change the brakes. I've gathered everything I need to do this brake job. So first of all, I loosened the cap off the brake fluid reservoir because when you push the pistons out, some of the fluid comes back in, you want to give it some air. The brake fluid looks disgusting, so that's the next job I've got to do. I have my jack positioned under one of the two jacking points. There's actually three, but one of them's hidden under the under tray. You can get away with jacking up the side of the car just at this front jacking point. And you will see I've got my trusty Montreal Canadiens hockey puck on there. Because this jack has quite a wide pad and I don't want to damage the underside of the car. And you will see there's a blue sticker on the underside of the car which tells you where you can jack it up. It's very important not to jack it up anywhere else. I have the trusty key to undo the bolts on the wheels, 17mm socket, replacement brakes, torque wrench, lost the dog, but that's about it. That's all we need. So I'm going to loosen off the wheels before I jack it up, and this should be a record-breaking time for changing the brakes, if I can remember how to do it. And look who's arrived to help. Hello, Tasha. Tasha, say hello. Yes, good dog. The chassis on this car is so stiff that if you jack it up on one side, the other side comes off the ground as well. So you only have to jack it once. Careful, Tasha. And I think if you jack it at the rear, because the rear jacking point's kind of in the middle, it'll jack up the side of the car. But it really doesn't matter. You can only do two wheels at a time. So I'm going to do the front and then I'm going to do the back. Now, normally I would put a car up on jack stands, but I'm not going to be working underneath it. So it will be safe on the jack. The dog's out of the way. And as always, I put the wheel underneath the sill just in case. But this is a relatively easy, straightforward job, no stress. All we're going to do is we have to pull out these pins. The spring comes off, and then hopefully Bob is your uncle, and the pads come out, push back the pistons, and then put in the new pads. It's that simple. Actually, looking at this, I noticed that there's a split pin missing here. There should be a split pin in there just to hold this through pin in place. So I know I don't have any here. I don't think of that size, so I'm going to have to... I'll put it all back together, and then I'll find one and put it in there, which is probably what I said the last time. This spring holds everything in place, so there's no real danger. You can push the spring in with your finger, and that will help release the tension, and you can pull the pin straight out. Now there's no tension on this one, and we just pull that pin straight out. My nice rusty brakes. And my wife is screaming, and then you can just put a little bit of pressure on to push the pistons back, and then out come the pads. You can actually use the pad just to push the piston back in, and then your pad comes out. And that's not too bad, but I've got new pads, so I might as well use them. So what I like to do is just wedge the pad in there and push the piston all the way in. So now I've got lots of space there. Of course, what that does is push against this piston, but that one's out. There's less meat left on that one, so it's a good job we're replacing these. So if we can just wedge that in there. And then just use the old pad to push the piston in. Now, one of the things that is important before you put these pads in is to stick on these shims. So when I was tracking the car, I didn't bother with these because they're there to cut down squeal. But on the street, you are going to miss them if you don't put them on. Now, you don't need to put grease on these as well. You can just have these, stick them on right away. The rear brakes actually come with them ready installed. The front brakes don't, which is kind of strange. So when you're putting new pads in, you have to push the pistons all the way in. There, that one's all the way in now. So this should just slide in. There we go. Make sure those holes are lined up, and then we'll do the same thing on the other side. I think this piston's as far back as it will go. We'll just slide that in. Come on, you can do it. There we go. See this? Top pin goes back in. Sometimes it's a little bit finicky. Don't forget your spring. So the spring hooks underneath like that, and then pushes down, and then the bottom one goes through. And don't forget your split pins. There's your split pin. That's what I love about track focus cars, is how easy it is to replace the brakes. I mean, that literally, the hardest thing is pushing the pistons back in. There's the old pad. You can see that side on, how little friction material there is. And there's the new pad. So it really was time to change. They didn't feel good at all. I'm only driving this on the road now, so it's not, they weren't critical, but on the track, those pads would overheat real quick and fade. And these pads actually come with a break-in coating. So when you're bedding in the brakes, this coating is a high friction coating, which helps bed the brakes in. And these EBC brakes come with strict instructions on how to bed in the brakes. So I'll be doing that afterwards. But this side is done. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and then the front will be finished. I took the time to fish out a pair of gloves because brake work is dirty work, and I'm fed up of washing my hands and them being dirty, and it's probably not good for you. So, good pair of gloves. Now on to the rear. Now the jacking point for the rear, if I remember correctly, is somewhere in the middle of the car. It's right here. And I think if you jack here, both wheels on this side come off the ground. We will see. That's right. So we could have jacked it up there, but then we'd have to jack it up on the other side anyway. It would have saved me one bit of jackage. Anyway, let's get this wheel off and see what the brakes are like. If I remember correctly, you have to undo this bolt, the whole assembly pivots off, and then this pin you take out, and do the same thing for, you have to push in, you probably have to wind in the piston. The rear brakes only have a piston on the inside, so I'll probably use my super duper winding in tool to do that. I normally do it with a pair of needle nose pliers, but I had a nasty fight with an Audi TT a couple of weeks ago, and so I ended up buying the tool, which I've managed to do without for 30 odd years. Anyway, let's get this apart and we'll see. Well, the rear brakes are much more of a faff than the front brakes are. But doing the other side, I slowly remembered how to do it. You have to undo this bolt here, and that will allow the whole thing to swivel back. On the lower bolt, you remove this pin and this spring, and you do that by putting a nail in there. There's probably a fancy Lotus tool to do it, but you put a nail in here and bang it with a hammer. That means you can then swivel everything back, the pads fall out, you wind the adjuster back in, put the pads in, and you're off to the races. So let's see how well this works. So first of all, we have to take this nut off, which is, of course will not move. There we go. That is what the caliper slides on, and we could probably put some grease on that, but I never have done in the past. So that's the first part. The second part involves this teeny tiny little nail, which you have to feel for. There's a hole in the back of here, and this is probably difficult to do on the camera, but that nail goes in there. And then you drop it on this epoxy floor, which means you can't see it. I'm going to have to take my gloves off to do this. If you can see, that nail just goes in the hole there, and then you bang your thumb as many times as you possibly can. You see that the pin is just coming out on this side. You keep doing that till that nail is pretty much all the way in. And then this you can then pull out with your needly nose pliers, like that. Okay? And then there's this spring assembly, which I always put the pin back through it so I can remember which way up it went. To my mind, that was upside down, but we'll see when we put it back in together. I may have put it in upside down, or maybe not. Anyway, so that's the hard work. You can then wiggle this around, and we took that bolt out, so it takes a bit of finagling sometimes. What I find is if you can actually bang off the outside caliper and just kind of get that loose. Let's remove this nail here. Now, if you can get the outside caliper off, it makes pivoting. There you go. See, those they're not too bad. But now this is loose, and this whole thing pivots back like that. You can get the inside one out. As I said before, we'll keep those. Now, here's the neat bit. So, to adjust the handbrake, these cylinders wind out and adjust themselves. So all you need to do, this one's tighter than the other one, is you wind it back in. You just push and turn with the pliers. So there we go, that's winding in nice and easily now. Perfect. Now, you could put some grease on the cylinder face to stop any squealing, but these brakes, these EBC brakes come with shims already on them. so you generally don't need to put anything on it. And again, they have this break-in friction layer, which means I looked at the instructions about bedding. You don't actually need to bed the brakes like you would normally, which is it's kind of nice when you're on track, but on the street it really doesn't matter. Now these are a really tight fit because of the paint. So that's the inside one in, and this caliper, and it should move freely, there we go, in and out, and we will just fit. There you go, you see that clicks into place, and all we need to do now is pivot everything back. You just need to push that assembly out of the way, put the bolt back in. Hopefully you can still see, and I'll do it here. Put the bolt back in. And that is it. The one thing I will say is make sure that you put the pads in with the friction material facing the disc. I did this once and I was in a real rush, and I went out. I couldn't understand why the brakes were making such a noise. And I put the bloody brake pad on inside out, which was a bit stupid. But that's what happens when you rush. So take your time. It's the kind of thing you do once and remember forever. Right. Now we have to put this puppy back in. Now I would have, on the other side it was the other way up, but I think it's because it's the same caliper, so they actually have to mount it the other way around. That goes in very nicely, so I'm not going to worry about it. And as long as it's applying spring pressure on this pin and on the pad, it doesn't matter. So let's get it in now. Just hit it with a hammer. A fine center punch would do this just as well, but I do it just with, not good for your tools to do this, but just something to knock it all the way in so that it's got a little spring collar around it so that locks in. And that is that. Brakes are done. So we just need to stick the wheel back on, torque everything, and we're good to go. One last job, just to refit the brake fluid cap. As I said, this brake fluid looks like poop, so I'll be replacing that. That's the first of the summer projects done. It wasn't even on the list of projects, so I can't cross it off the board, but now I've got good brakes on the Elise. I have to remember the first time I go out just to be gentle on the brakes, and I'm just going to hop in the car now and just press on the brakes just to get the pads up against the discs. So we hope that was entertaining. Thank you for watching. If you like, please give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us your comments below. And until the next time, which is probably tomorrow, cheers.